He announced her demotion into a microphone in front of 400 employees, while his mistress stood smiling in the front row. His family applauded. The board clapped. What none of them noticed was the folder resting quietly in her lap, the document proving she had owned the company long before he ever walked through its doors. The building was all glass and steel and quiet pride. Monroe Pinnacle Group sat 40 stories above the Atlanta skyline, like something that had always belonged there, like something that had grown out of the earth on its own, without hands, without sacrifice, without a woman who had bent herself into invisible shapes, so that a man she loved could look tall in every room he entered. On the morning of the annual all-hands address, the atrium filled slowly with 400 employees who spoke in low voices about promotions and projections, none of them stopping to ask a single question about the woman in the simple black dress who had arrived before any of them and taken her seat in the third row without ceremony, with nothing but a worn leather folder resting across her knees and a stillness about her that should have told everyone in that building everything they needed to know. Her name was Celeste Monroe. She was 38 years old. She had a voice like still water and eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. She had worn the simple black dress on purpose, the way a woman wears something when she has already made her decision and no longer needs the world's approval of it. The folder in her lap was old. The leather had gone soft at the corners, the brass clasp slightly tarnished, the edges worn down by years of hands that had carried it through rooms exactly like this one. Nobody in that atrium knew what was inside it. Nobody had ever thought to ask. That was the thing about Celeste. People had always looked at her the way you look at furniture in a room, registered her presence, accepted her as part of the setting, and then directed their attention toward the thing they had actually come to see. The thing they had come to see walked out at 9:15 with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the applause was for him. Darnell Monroe was 42 years old and built like a man who had always known he was being watched. He wore his suits the way some men wear armor, not for protection but for performance. His smile came easy and landed wide, the kind of smile that made investors feel chosen and employees feel seen. He was magnetic in the particular way of men who have been told they are extraordinary for so long that they have stopped questioning whether the word fits. He took the microphone from the MC with one hand, smoothed the front of his jacket with the other, and let the room settle into the kind of silence that waits for permission to become something. He spoke for 20 minutes about vision and legacy and the next horizon of growth. He used the word family 4 times. He used the word sacrifice twice, which was interesting because Celeste had once counted the ways she had given that word a body and a heartbeat in service of everything he was currently describing as his own. Then his tone changed. It was subtle enough that most people could not say exactly when it happened, only that something in the quality of his voice dropped half a register and his jaw set itself at a different angle. The face he wore when he had rehearsed something he was not entirely comfortable saying but had committed to anyway. He spoke about restructuring. He used words like optimization and talent alignment and right-sizing contribution levels. He said the company had reached a stage in its evolution where every role needed to reflect the actual value being delivered, where sentiment could not substitute for performance, where family connections. He paused there, just long enough for the word to find its target, could not be allowed to compromise the integrity of the leadership structure. Then he said her name. He said it the way you say the name of something you are putting down. No warmth, no history, no acknowledgement of a single one of the 15 years. That name had been the quiet engine underneath everything he was standing on. He announced her new role in the Facilities Operations Department, Level 1, effective immediately. Celeste did not move. She simply placed one hand on top of the leather folder in her lap. pressed her palm flat against it once and looked forward. The young woman 6 rows behind her, a 26-year-old analyst named Brianna, who had learned more about building something real from 3 quiet conversations with Celeste than from 4 years of business school, felt her throat close and had to look down at her shoes to keep herself together. In the front row, Monique Charles allowed herself one slow, satisfied smile. She was 32 years old and precise in every choice she made, including this one. She had worn the cream blazer because she knew it photographed well and because she knew the live stream cameras would sweep the front row. She stood with the posture of a woman who is preparing to inherit something and wants to look like she has always owned it. She did not look at Celeste. She did not need to. The demotion announcement had been her idea. She had written the first draft of the language in a hotel room 2 months ago while Darnell slept. Near the back, Loretta Monroe sat with her back straight and her hands folded and a look on her face that was almost peaceful. She was 64 years old and had been waiting for this morning for a very long time. She had worn her good earrings. When Darnell finished reading the announcement, Loretta pressed her lips together in the way of a woman trying not to smile in church and failing slightly. Terrence, seated 2 chairs to her left, applauded with the mechanical rhythm of a man clapping for something he wants to be over. Darnell did not look at Celeste once. Near the side of the atrium, a live stream camera on a tripod was broadcasting to thousands of remote employees across the country. It swept the room slowly at the end of the applause. For exactly 2 seconds, the lens caught a woman in a black dress, with a worn leather folder pressed flat beneath her palm, her face entirely composed, looking forward. Several people watching from laptops in Houston and Chicago, and Charlotte would later say she looked, in that moment, like the only person in the room who already knew how the story ended. Nobody thought anything of the folder. Not yet. The meeting ended the way meetings like that always end, with applause that trails off into chairs scraping, and people reaching for their phones, and the busy noise of 400 people who have been given something uncomfortable to process, and have collectively decided to process it by not processing it at all. They filtered out of the atrium in clusters, talking about quarterly numbers and new product rollouts, and almost none of them said the name Celeste Monroe as they walked away, because the demotion of a woman they had never been encouraged to know was not the kind of thing that interrupted a workday the way it should have. One person stayed in her chair until the room was nearly empty. Brianna was 26 years old and had been with the company 3 years and had known from her first week that the quiet woman in the 3rd row was the reason half of what made this place worth working at existed. Celeste had spent 45 minutes with her once, reviewing a financial model Brianna had been struggling with, and in those 45 minutes she had not once made Brianna feel small for not already knowing what she was being shown. Brianna sat in the emptying atrium and looked at the spot where Celeste had been sitting and felt something harden inside her chest. She picked up her bag and went back to her desk and did not say a word to anyone. She just worked. It was the only form of loyalty available to her, and she understood that Celeste would have recognized it as such. Celeste walked out of the building the way she had walked in, steady, unhurried, the leather folder under her arm. Now the story had to go back. All the way back, past the marble floors and the glass towers, back to the place where Celeste Monroe first learned what it meant to build something that could not be taken from you. Vine Street in Atlanta in 1994 smelled like October and cornbread, and the particular peace that settles into a house when the people inside it do not have much, but have learned to treat what they have like it is sacred. The house was small and yellow, with a porch that leaned slightly to the left, and on Saturday mornings the sound of gospel music came through the screen door mixed with the smell of frying bacon and the low voice of a man who did not raise it unless he was singing. Elroy Washington was not a wealthy man. He owned a corner store on Flat Shoals Avenue that he opened at 6 in the morning 6 days a week, and a single rental property he maintained with his own hands. He was a deacon at Mount Calvary Baptist. He believed in three things with equal conviction: the Lord, the dignity of honest work, and the permanent power of a signed piece of paper. His daughter was 12 years old and carried a notebook everywhere and asked questions too large for her age and looked at the world with the expression of someone who was memorizing it for later use. On a Saturday in October, he sat Celeste down at the kitchen table and spread a business contract flat in front of her, a lease renewal for the rental property. He pointed to each paragraph slowly, explaining obligations, consequences, the weight of what it meant when two people put their names to something. She did not fully understand it. He said that was fine. Understanding would come with time, but the first thing she needed to learn was not the words themselves, but the weight of them. The one who is silent in the room, he told her, is usually the one who owns it. She wrote it down. He told her the world would spend a great deal of energy trying to convince her that loudness and visibility were the same thing as power, that the name on the press release was the one who built the thing. He told her that was almost never true, that the truest power was the kind that did not need an audience to be real, that lived in documents and signatures and held their meaning long after the noise of a room had died down. When Celeste turned 18, Elroy gave her the leather folder. It was old even then. Brown leather, soft at the corners, brass clasp shaped like a small crescent moon. Inside was a single blank page. Put something in here worth keeping, he told her, something nobody can take out of your hands once you sign it. She carried that folder through college, through 2 jobs, through a return to Atlanta and a position at a mid-size investment firm where she spent her lunch hours reading filings her colleagues did not have time for. She was carrying it the night she sat across from a man named Darnell at a dinner party in Decatur and watched him hold a room with nothing but the warmth of his presence and thought, with the clear-eyed precision of a woman trained to see what others overlooked. I could build something extraordinary if I had someone who could stand in front of it while I built. She was 23, brilliant, lonely, wrong about one thing. She identified 3 undervalued black-owned logistics companies that, merged under a single holding structure, could become the foundation of something that had never existed before in the American South. She spent 4 months on the financial model alone. She secured the first 2 investors through her father's church connections, quiet men with quiet money who had known Elroy Washington for 30 years and trusted his daughter's handshake the way they had trusted his. She brought Darnell in as the public face. She wrote the business plan. She structured the founding equity agreement, and she buried a clause on page 47 that gave the primary architect of the company a 34% controlling interest in perpetuity, regardless of any future title changes or restructuring decisions. She signed it. Darnell signed it. His lawyer reviewed the first 12 pages and called it clean. Nobody read page 47. She put the signed copy inside the leather folder and latched the brass clasp and called her father that night. She told him she had found something worth keeping. He said he was proud of her. Then he said, "Remember what the silence is for." For 15 years, she remembered. She made a deliberate choice to step back from the public face of the company, not because she was forced to, but because she understood that Darnell's ego would eventually crack the foundation if it was not carefully managed. She became the invisible hand, the silent architect. She held 34% of a company worth nothing at the time, kept it in a folder no one ever asked about, and let her husband believe he had built something alone. Nadine warned her once, "You can't keep giving a man credit for a house you built, Celeste. One day he will try to lock you out of it." Celeste had smiled and said, "He can try. The deed has my name on it." She had genuinely believed, at 23, that presence and architecture were equal contributions, that building something and standing in front of it were worth the same, that love and partnership lived in the same house and shared the same name. She would spend the next 15 years slowly understanding in the quiet and private way of hard lessons that she had been wrong about one of those things and absolutely right about everything else. But memory is not protection, and a woman can know exactly what she is worth and still spend years watching someone spend it. The betrayal did not arrive all at once. It came the way cold comes into a house with old windows, gradually through the small gaps, until one morning you realize you have been shivering for a very long time without knowing when the warmth stopped. Monique Charles joined Monroe Pinnacle 14 months before the all-hands address as a strategy consultant on a 6-month contract that Darnell extended without consulting anyone. She had read him within the first week. She understood the architecture of his insecurity, that behind the polished CEO was a man who had never built anything himself, and knew it somewhere beneath the confidence, and that what that kind of man needed most was someone to convince him that the thing he had not built was actually his. Within 3 months, she was in his office at hours with no business justification. Within 6, she had replaced his doubt with a story, a careful, constructed story in which Celeste was the weight on his ankle, the quiet, undermining presence whose silence read as contempt, whose invisible role in the company confused investors and made him look weak. She said it all with the tone of a consultant delivering an objective assessment, which is the most dangerous way to deliver a lie. Loretta Monroe had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for 15 years. She had never wanted Celeste for her son, not because Celeste had done a single thing to deserve that resentment. She had cooked for the family, attended the church dinners, sat through the Sunday meals with her back straight and her voice gentle and her patience applied, like spackling over every slight Loretta delivered with a smile. But Celeste was self-sufficient in a way that Loretta had always read as arrogance. A woman who did not need the Monroe family's approval was a woman who had not been properly claimed by it. Loretta had whispered that reading into Darnell's ear since the beginning of the marriage, not in arguments but in small, consistent deposits of doubt, delivered over years of late-night calls that always ended with some version of, "I just want what's best for you, baby." When Monique began feeding the same narrative, the two stories found each other and merged into something Darnell could no longer distinguish from the truth. Terrence saw fabricated emails in March. Monique had constructed them carefully, a thread appearing to show Celeste in communication with 2 minority shareholders about a proxy play against Darnell's leadership. There was no such communication, but the emails looked real, and Terrence had never trusted Celeste, and Monique had chosen her timing well. 3 days after Celeste had quietly corrected an error in his acquisition analysis in front of 2 external advisors, Terrence brought the emails to the board. The vote to restructure Celeste's role passed 3-2. She was not invited to the meeting. She found out on a Tuesday morning from a member of the cleaning staff who had overheard 2 executives talking in an elevator. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes, a building she had helped design the financing for, a city that would not have known Darnell Monroe's name without her. She thought about her father and the kitchen table and the contract spread flat between them. She thought about what he had told her silence was for. Then she called Nadine. Nadine Foster had been Celeste's best friend since they were 8 years old on Vine Street. She had sat through every dinner, every slight, every Sunday, watching Celeste absorb what the Monroe family delivered with the patience of a woman playing a longer game than anyone else in the room could see. She had asked her once, 5 years into the marriage, "Are you okay with this, really?" Celeste had said yes, not the way women say yes when they mean no. but the way women say yes when they mean, I am building something that takes time, and I need you to trust that I know what I am doing. Nadine had trusted it. Let them do it, Celeste said. Nadine was quiet for 3 seconds. You sure? I've been sure since page 47. That night, Celeste sat alone at her home office desk. The leather folder was open in front of her. She read the clause her 23-year-old self had written without anyone's guidance. She cried. She let herself cry fully and without managing it, because she was alone and the door was shut. She cried for the 23-year-old who had believed that love and partnership were the same thing. She cried for the 15 years she had been the engine of something that never put her name on the front of it. She cried for her father who had given her a folder and a warning and trusted her to know what to do with both. Then she stopped. She closed the folder. She made 3 calls, to her attorney, to the lead independent board member, Dr. Everett Cole, and to the founding legal firm that held the original incorporation documents in a fireproof drawer in their Midtown office. Then she put the folder in her bag, turned off the light, went to bed and slept the deep, clean sleep of a woman who has finally stopped carrying something she was never meant to carry alone. She had been building for a long time. Now she was going to open the door. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Atlanta Intercontinental on a Friday night in April when the city was warm and 600 people had dressed themselves in their finest things to celebrate the man they believed had built an empire from nothing. Darnell Monroe's photo had run in 2 magazines. He had given a podcast interview in which he described himself as a builder who had always surrounded himself with people who shared his vision. Nobody in his communications team had mentioned Celeste Monroe by name in any of it. She arrived at 8:14. She had worn white. Not for the room, not for the cameras, not for Darnell. She wore it for herself, because white was what her mother had worn on the day she married Elroy, and because white was what Celeste had worn the morning she signed the founding agreement, and because white is the color of a woman who has decided she is done apologizing for the space she takes up. The gown was simple and devastating in the way of things that do not need to work hard to be beautiful. No jewelry except her mother's plain gold wedding band. The leather folder was not in a bag. It was in her hand, held with the unhurried authority of a woman carrying something that belongs to her. The room noticed her before she noticed the room. She walked to the table reserved for the company's founding stakeholders, a round table near the front with gold name placards set out by the hotel staff using the guest list from the original founding gala 15 years prior. Her name was on a placard. No one had removed it. No one had thought to, because in 15 years, nobody at Monroe Pinnacle had gotten around to asking whose name had been there first. She sat. She placed the leather folder on the table in front of her, with the brass clasp facing up. Darnell saw her from across the room. Something moved through his face. First confusion, then irritation, then a rapid recalculation that did not resolve into anything comfortable. He said something to Terrence. Terrence shrugged with the shrug of a man who has decided that whatever is about to happen is someone else's problem. Monique, beside Darnell in a red dress, kept her face perfectly still. She had not expected Celeste to come. She had underestimated what kind of woman Celeste Monroe was. That error would cost her everything she had spent 14 months building. The Founder of the Year segment was last. The citation was read by a council member given the approved talking points, the vision, the sacrifice, the legacy, the extraordinary achievement of a man who had begun with nothing and built something that changed the landscape of black enterprise in America. The language was beautiful and specific and did not contain a single word that was true in the way the speaker intended. Darnell took the stage. He took the plaque. He began his speech. He was 3 minutes in when Dr. Everett Cole stood from his seat near the front, walked to the podium without hurry, and placed a sealed document envelope beside the plaque. He did not speak. He returned to his seat and sat with his hands folded on the table. Darnell looked at the envelope. His voice stopped in the middle of a sentence. The pause lasted 4 seconds. The room felt it but could not name it. Celeste stood. She did not rush. She did not perform the walk. She moved through that room the way water moves through stone. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but with the absolute certainty of something that has been moving toward its destination for a very long time and has never once had any intention of stopping. She reached the podium. Darnell stepped back half a step, not in surrender, but in the involuntary way of a man whose body has understood something his mind is still refusing. Celeste set the leather folder on the podium. She unlatched the brass clasp. She removed a single stapled document, pages that had spent 15 years waiting inside that brown leather shell for a moment exactly like this one. She placed it beside the award plaque. She looked at the room. Her voice, when it came, was the quietest sound in that ballroom. It was also the only sound. "My name," she said, "is Celeste Monroe. I am the primary architect and 34% controlling shareholder of Monroe Pinnacle Group. I wrote the original business plan. I structured the founding equity agreement. I secured the first investors. I wrote the clause on page 47 that preserved my controlling interest in perpetuity, regardless of any title changes or restructuring decisions made by any person, board, or executive body, including the decisions made in this company over the last 14 months. She paused. She let the room sit with it. In 2013, she continued, when a reckless acquisition deal created a liquidity crisis that came within 11 days of dissolving this company entirely, I personally guaranteed the bridge loan that kept Monroe Pinnacle solvent. I did it quietly. I did not put my name on the press release. I did not ask for acknowledgement. I was protecting something I had built, and I knew that was enough. Another pause. The room had gone to a silence that has weight to it, that presses against the chest. 2 weeks ago, she said, the man I am still legally married to used a company microphone to reduce my title to facilities coordinator at a company I co-founded in front of 400 employees, while the woman he has been conducting an affair with for 14 months stood in the front row and smiled. His brother voted to authorize that demotion without reading the legal implications of restructuring the role of a controlling shareholder. His mother applauded. Nobody in that ballroom made a sound. Effective tonight, Celeste said, I am exercising my authority as controlling shareholder to initiate an emergency board review. All executive appointments and restructuring decisions made in the last 18 months are hereby suspended pending a full legal and governance audit. Dr. Cole has been informed. The founding legal firm has been informed. The relevant documentation, she touched the folder once, has been on file for 15 years. She picked up the leather folder. She latched the brass clasp. She looked at Darnell, just once. The way you look at a door you are finally closing. He looked back at her from the stage, and there was nothing in his face that she had not already accounted for. No revelation, no remorse, only the stunned and hollow expression of a man who has just understood that the house was never his, that every floor he walked on, every wall he leaned against, every name etched above the entrance belonged to someone he had spent 15 years trying to make small, and that her smallness had been the only thing standing between him and this moment. She had chosen to let him have the moment, on his own terms, in front of the room. Congratulations on your award, she said. She walked back to her seat. She sat down. She placed the folder on the table with the brass clasp facing up, and she folded her hands on top of it, and she looked forward, and she did not look at any of them again for the rest of the night. The legal audit took 11 days. It moved with the velocity of things that have had a long time to build up momentum. What it found was not complicated. It was only painful, in the way that all obvious things are painful when they are finally said out loud. Darnell Monroe's CEO appointment had been structured on a 5-year renewable contract requiring shareholder approval for renewal. The last renewal was due 3 years prior. Celeste, as controlling shareholder, had never signed it. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had thought to check. For 3 years, the CEO of a $72 billion company had been operating on a contract that existed in name only. A man conducting himself as the landlord of a house he did not own, while the deed sat in a leather folder in his wife's hand. The board voted 14 days after the gala. The outcome was not close. Darnell was removed. He was offered a non-executive advisory role at a compensation level that reflected his actual contribution. He declined. He told people the decision had been his, that he had chosen to step away from an organization that had lost its original vision. He said this in a post on social media that received 342 likes and was never picked up by any business press outlet that had been writing about him 2 months prior, because none of them returned his publicist's calls. The magazines that had run his photo did not run a correction. They simply moved on to the next story, the way the world always moves on from men who have been proved wrong about themselves, not with ceremony or cruelty, but with the quiet indifference of a current that never required their presence to keep moving. He moved out of the house in Buckhead, the house that Celeste's early shareholder dividends had provided the down payment for, and into a rented apartment across the city. He called Monique 4 times the first week, 3 the second, once the third. After that, she stopped answering. Monique Charles had built her entire position on a consulting contract containing a conflict of interest clause she had not read carefully enough. The audit flagged it on day 3. Her agreement was terminated. Her VP appointment, never formally ratified through proper governance channels, was voided. She filed a wrongful termination claim. The company's legal team responded with documentation of her personal relationship with the previous CEO, predating her VP appointment by 8 months. She settled. The settlement was not large. She left Atlanta 4 weeks after the gala and did not say goodbye to anyone, because there was no one left to say goodbye to. Terrence Monroe lost his board seat. The audit established that he had voted on a governance matter with a direct, undisclosed personal conflict. Monique had been quietly consulting his own private investment vehicle while simultaneously presenting him with the fabricated evidence against Celeste. He did not contest the findings. Loretta called Celeste 3 times over the following weeks. Celeste did not answer. On the 3rd call, Loretta left a 4-minute voicemail containing an apology of the kind that apologizes more for the consequences than for the act itself. Nadine listened to it and sent Loretta a single text. "She doesn't have anything to say to you." Loretta read it at her kitchen table and sat there a long time without moving, looking at the place where she had written Celeste's name in the family Bible 15 years ago on the day of the wedding. The ink, still dark, still certain, still refusing to disappear, no matter how long Loretta had spent trying to make the woman it belonged to do the same. There was a Sunday dinner at the Monroe family house the following month. Loretta had set a 5th place out of habit, the seat where Celeste had always sat. She did not notice it until halfway through the meal when Terrence glanced at it and looked away. Loretta looked at the empty plate. She looked at the chair. She did not remove either. She passed the green beans and kept her eyes on her food and said nothing about it for the rest of the evening. Darnell sat at the table eating and looking like a man performing the act of being fine for an audience too tired to applaud him anymore. In October, Celeste bought the house on Vine Street. It had passed out of the family when Elroy died 7 years ago, and she had tracked the address of every owner it had passed through since then because she had always intended to come back for it. She bought it from a young couple who had run out of time for the renovation they planned. The closing took 3 weeks. On the afternoon the keys were handed over, she drove there alone, parked in front of the porch that still leaned slightly to the left, and sat in her car for a while. Then she went in. She fixed what was broken and left everything else exactly as it was. The floors were the same floors. The kitchen still carried the smell of 1,000 meals, cooked with love and care, and the understanding that feeding someone is a form of honoring them. She put her father's writing desk back in the study. She put his Bible on the shelf above it. She put the leather folder on the shelf beside the Bible. It was the first time in 20 years that it had not been in a bag or on her arm or pressed beneath her palm. She stepped back and looked at it resting there, finished, still, done with the work it had been given to do. She planted a garden in the backyard. She had never gardened before. She found that it suited her, the patience of it, the faith required to put something in the ground and trust the conditions you had prepared. She planted tomatoes and collard greens and her father's favorite, yellow squash. She watered them in the early mornings before the heat arrived and sat on the back steps with her coffee and watched the light move across the yard and thought about her father and the kitchen table and the sound of his voice on a Saturday in October when she was 12 years old, and the whole rest of her life was still a blank page, waiting to be filled with something worth keeping. She did not think about Monroe Pinnacle. She did not think about the gala or the boardroom or the man who had said her name into a microphone like it was something to be discarded. She thought about yellow squash and morning light and the good, clean feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be. She called Nadine every morning. Nadine drove out on Sundays and they sat on the porch that still leaned slightly to the left and ate and talked and laughed at things that had nothing to do with companies or contracts or men who had mistaken silence for surrender. In November, Celeste accepted the title of chairwoman of the board of Monroe Pinnacle Group. She did not take the CEO role. She hired instead a woman named Dr. Adaz Okafor, 40 years old, from Houston, a brilliant and careful builder who had come up through operations and understood the difference between a company's face and its foundation. When they met for the first time, Dr. Okafor shook her hand and said, "I know what you built here." Celeste smiled and said, "Good." That was the beginning of something that would go on to be more than either of them could have planned. She gave one interview, a small podcast run by a young black woman in Atlanta named Corinne, who covered untold business stories. Celeste sat in that studio for 40 minutes and spoke without drama about what she had built and why and how and what it had cost. She spoke about her father. She spoke about page 47. She spoke about the 15 years of Sunday dinners and boardroom silences and the particular discipline required to hold your power in your hands without letting anyone see it until the moment they most needed to understand that it had always been there. She did not speak about Darnell by name. She did not need to. The story carried his shape in every paragraph without him having to be present for it. When Corinne asked why she had waited so long, Celeste was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. She looked back up. "I didn't wait," she said. "I was building." The episode was shared 40,000 times in the first week. Every major business publication that had stopped returning Darnell's calls ran the story within 10 days. On a Sunday morning in the spring, exactly 1 year after the gala, Celeste sat at her father's writing desk with the leather folder open in front of her. She removed the founding document one last time and took it to a framing shop on Flat Shoals Avenue, 3 blocks from where Elroy's corner store had stood. She had it framed behind glass with the signature on page 47 facing out. She hung it on the wall of the study beside a photograph of Elroy Washington standing outside his store in 1987. A Saturday from the look of it, the morning light on his face, his hands in his pockets. A quiet man who had built small things with great care and spent his life giving his daughter the tools to build something he would never live to see. She stood back and looked at both of them together for a long time. Then she put the blank pages back inside the folder, latched the brass clasp, put it in the drawer of his desk. Not gone, not finished, just resting in the way of things that have done their work and are ready to begin again when the time is right. There is a kind of woman the world has always tried to make invisible. Not because she is weak, because she is dangerous when she is finally seen. The world understands somewhere deep down that a woman who builds quietly and carries her receipts and does not need your applause to know her own worth is a woman whose patience is a strategy, whose stillness is weight, whose silence is a choice, a deliberate, long-planned choice made by someone who has always known exactly when to open the folder and what to say when she does. Celeste Monroe was never hiding. She was never broken. She was never the woman in the corner who did not know her value. She was the woman who wrote her value into a document at 23 years old and then spent 15 years watching the people around her fail to read it. And she did not despair at that. She did not lower herself to the noise of people who had mistaken her patience for permission. She waited for the right moment. Then she stood up. Then she walked to a podium. Then she opened a folder. That was enough. That has always been enough. Because the one who is silent in the room, as a quiet man from Vine Street once told his daughter at a kitchen table in 1994, is usually the one who owns it. If Celeste's story moved you, if you have ever been the person in the room who built something and then watched someone else take the credit for it, I need you to know, this story was made for you. Hit that like button right now. Not for the algorithm, for every person who ever held their dignity quietly in a room full of people who thought they had taken everything. Subscribe if you are new here. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories about people who were counted out, written off, and left for nothing, and then showed the world exactly who they always were. Leave me a comment before you go. Tell me, did Celeste do the right thing by waiting? Or should she have spoken sooner? I read every single one, and I will see you in the next story.